It's U of L Today on 93.9 The Phil. Here's your host, Mark Hebert.
And welcome to U of L Today with Mark Hebert on 93.9 The Phil. We're so glad you're joining us today. We've got a show packed for the next 30 minutes or so. You're going to learn a little something about the University of Louisville. We've got lots of stuff coming up, so hang with us for the next 30 minutes. You'll learn something. First of all, we're going to talk to Susan Galandiuk. She is a doctor with the University of Louisville. And for those of us who are over 50 and have had colonoscopies, we realize we have to have them to protect against colon cancer, but we really don't want to have them, right? Well, Susan is the director of U of L's section of colon and rectal surgery, and she's working on an important and much easier new screening process for polyps and colon cancer that will make things easier for those of us over 50 who have to get these colonoscopies. So, Susan, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me here. No, we're excited. The work that we're currently pursuing is developing a blood test that would enable us to identify patients who have colon polyps or colon cancers, so we would be able to target those people who actually need a colonoscopy. Unfortunately, we're lagging behind in terms of people who should be screened currently. Many of them aren't being screened simply because they don't want to have screening tests.
Well, for those of us over 50 who have had colonoscopies, I can attest they are no fun. The colonoscopy is not bad. It's the drinking the liquid, the gallon of stuff you have to drink to clean yourself out that is just no fun. For those of you that aren't 50 yet and haven't had one, I can assure you the colonoscopy, the actual procedure, is no big deal. But so the blood test would get rid of, right? Would get rid of me having to drink that gallon of stuff to clean me out the night before, right?
Correct. And interestingly, a blood test was just approved by the FDA last week as a screening test for colon cancer. Our test is going to be even better, even more sensitive in that. But one of the problems is that colon cancer is actually preventable. It begins as a harmless growth in the colon called a polyp. And if that polyp is removed by colonoscopy, you don't develop cancer. And our problem is that because people don't have screening tests to identify it at this stage before it becomes a cancer, we sadly have a very high rate of colorectal cancer in Kentucky.
So the blood test that you're working on, how is that different than the one that was recently announced and is out there now?
It has a much higher accuracy rate.
Okay. And accuracy, and it also targets polyps? Is that another
correctly,
thing?
Correct. The test that was approved last week identifies only cancers, and our goal basically is to identify polyps. So in other words, identify people before they develop cancer.
So I'm going to ask the question everybody that's listening is going to ask: how soon before this blood test might be available to us?
Sadly, several years, but we're working hard on it.
And when you say several years, I guess it still has to go through some sort of trials or something, clinical trials?
Correct. It has to go through a lot of confirmatory trials, and we're actually trying to miniaturize it so it would be something that would be available that a doctor's office, for example, could do.
So we're talking to Dr. Susan Galandiuk from the University of Louisville, and we're talking about this colon cancer test that she is working on. It's a blood test. But you've already done some. Some patients have already had this. You've already tried this out on a few, right?
We've already tested it on blood samples from over 330 patients, and we actually just presented our findings last week at a national meeting. So we're very excited about our preliminary results.
And what were those preliminary results?
Well,
What'd you find?
It had a very high accuracy at identifying patients with polyps. It was also able to identify patients with colorectal cancer, and very importantly, it was specific for colorectal cancer, meaning it could differentiate patients with colon cancer as opposed to those patients who had other types of cancers, for example, prostate, lung, or breast cancer, which is very important because many times patients who develop colorectal cancer are of an age where they might also have other cancers. So you want a test that is accurate enough that they can pinpoint exactly which disease this is.
Right now, what percentage of people over 50, and I guess African Americans are supposed to have colonoscopies at what age? 40?
A little bit earlier. For an average risk patient, which means a patient who doesn't have a first-degree relative, in other words, mother, father, sister, or brother who has colorectal cancer, we generally start screening at age 50. But in African Americans, we actually start screening a little bit earlier at age 45. And sadly, right now, we estimate that about a third of the people who should be screened, in other words, in that age category, are not getting checked.
So is the idea behind having a blood test available that more people will do it just because it's less invasive?
Because it's easier. Because it's easier, and they don't have to drink that horrible laxative.
Yeah, we know about that.
So this way you would be able to say, for example, if I did a blood test on you and I found out you have like 90% chance that you have a polyp inside you, then we tell you, okay, have a colonoscopy to have that polyp removed, versus if the blood test would be normal, we'd say, you're fine, have the blood test again in 5 years or 3 years.
Right, that's what
and that would be a lot less expensive. And if you say like 1 out of 3 people who could be screened and is not being screened across the United States, that amounts to about 23 million people who aren't being checked. So that's a lot of money.
And a lot of them in Kentucky too, obviously. For colon cancer, the number of people that get colon cancer in the United States each year, do you have that number by any chance, or ballpark?
It's about 150,000 people. So that's a lot of people. And sadly, currently, about 2/3 of the people that are diagnosed with colon cancer are diagnosed with colon cancer at more advanced stages. And that means when it's already gone to lymph nodes or spread to other organs. And what that means, it's basically much harder to cure when it's gone to that area. And we as doctors would obviously love to either prevent it or diagnose it at earlier stages where we could actually cure it by surgery or have a higher chance of curing it.
Yeah, what is the death rate? I have no idea.
It basically depends on when you diagnose it. Okay. If you diagnose it early, your chance of curing it by surgery is extremely high and very good, whereas the later you diagnose it, in other words, the more it's spread, the less likely you are to cure it.
Well, do you think it's just the idea that you got to drink this nasty stuff, you got to take the pills and all that stuff beforehand to clean yourself out? Is that the main thing holding patients back from getting the screenings, or is it something else?
I think it mainly is that. Some issues are cost issues. People are worried it's going to cost them money. And in Kentucky, we're very lucky in that in January 1st of this year, a bill was actually passed where screening colonoscopies, if they turn into something else, in other words, if you have a screening colonoscopy and a polyp is identified, won't cost you anything extra. Now, sadly, that doesn't count Medicare patients, and there currently is actually national legislation that has been proposed. It's something called the Screen Act, to make sure that screening wouldn't cost anybody anything, because it really shouldn't be a barrier for people thinking, I don't want to get screened because it will cost me some money.
What do you tell people who say, I'm 55, 56, 58 years old, and I've never had a colonoscopy? What do you tell them?
That colon cancer is preventable, and it really is important. And it's not just age, it's anybody who has symptoms, because 1 out of 10 patients who has colorectal cancer is actually less than 50 years old. So every month or so, I see patients who've had bleeding or change in bowel habit. That means new onset of diarrhea, constipation. They say, oh, geez, this hemorrhoid problems, there's nothing, that wind up actually having colon cancer. So if there's any kind of symptoms such as bleeding, change of bowel habits that lasts for more than a month, you should have it checked no matter what. And very important things are family history. In other words, if you have parents, brothers or sisters that have colorectal cancer or polyps, that puts you at a much increased risk. So it's very important to have checkups.
Is heredity the biggest factor in colon cancer?
A very large factor, yes.
I know it is in my wife's family, so she's already had one and doesn't really like the idea of having to go back and have another one in 3 years.
Correct, and there we recommend more frequent screening, actually.
Okay, as we wrap this up, let's kind of finalize. Again, what's the research you're working on with this new test, and then, again, when might it be available, assuming that it's approved by the feds?
Well, we're developing a blood test to diagnose not only colorectal cancer, but colorectal polyps that's going to be more accurate than anything that's presently available. We foresee that it will be available most likely in 4 to 5 years.
Okay, Susan Galandiuk, thank you very much. Dr. Susan Galandiuk, thank you very much. She's with UofL section of colon and rectal surgery and has some advice for those of you who are over 50 or over 45 if you're African American and have not had a colonoscopy. Go get one, right?
Correct.